And in introduction, I'm just really pleased to be able to introduce David. I know some of you may not have met David Prever before, who's in my screen, at least on the left of my own. Um, David and his family are fairly new to Sam's, and his son Barney just had his bar mitzvah earlier this year. And David, as you will have seen, hopefully, has got a really interesting career as a radio broadcaster, journalist, involved in the BBC and the LBC and Talksport and Heart. The voice of BBC Oxfordshire's breakfast show. I don't know if we ever got anyone from Oxfordshire, I'm sorry to say, who may be a regular listener. But David's going to talk to us a little bit about his experience as a broadcaster, a little bit perhaps about recent drama around the Beeb in particular, and has some things to share with us as well. And he'll speak for a little bit, and then we'll have the opportunity to ask some questions. So I'm going to hand it over to David to make his screen very big. Sorry about that. And thank you very much for joining us this evening, David, and for sharing a little bit on our lost Havdallah home.
Thank you very much, Adam. Good evening, everybody. Hope you're all well. It's been a while since I did a short talk. I tried to work it out. I think it's probably been about 7 or 8 years. And usually I used to do an awful lot of these, especially when I was on LBC. For some reason, LBC has a big Jewish following. And as soon as I came out as Jewish on LBC, which I'll come to in a moment, suddenly the phone started ringing and I was invited to endless fish suppers all over the place. And it's much easier speaking after everyone's had a nice fish supper, but there we are. We can't have everything these days. It's also a funny thing that as I get older, I'm 54 now, and I'm less interested in my own stories. Rather, I'm far more interested in other people's stories than telling my own. I don't know whether you just get to a stage in life where you don't particularly want to talk about yourself very much anymore, but I'll make an exception this evening. And feel free, if you want to ask any questions along the way, then please do. In a moment, I'll try if I can get the audio to work. I know it can be a little bit tricky, but I'll play you some examples of stories that I've heard recently. I'm privileged in that I hear amazing stories every day at work from people, and some quite sensational ones lately. We'll talk a bit about the BBC, if you like, and whether or not it has a problem with Jews, which is the big question of the day. And I can talk a bit about news generally at the moment, and where we're going with news gathering and where we get our information from. And my story started, if I think about it now, in a very different time, a different era as well. 1984, I began my career. Margaret Thatcher was on her throne. There was the miners' strike that year. We had Robert Maxwell just buying the Daily Mirror. Princess Diana was the Princess of Wales. She'd just given birth to her second son, Henry. By the way, not Harry, but Henry, as he was born in those days, and known in those days. And I launched a new radio station. It was called Hereward Radio in Northampton. I left home 17 years old and went to work in Northampton at this station that was named after an Anglo-Saxon warrior, which I never quite understood, Hereward the Wake. And I was 17, and all I wanted to do was be on the radio. That was my big thing. I found what made me tick, what excited me, my element, as Ken Robinson, I don't know if you're familiar with Ken Robinson, the great educator, always talks about being in your element. And I was in my element. Put me in a studio and I felt like it was where I was meant to be, and it was what I wanted to do with my life. And this was a different era. If you go back to 1984, commercial radio was only 10 years old. BBC network radio in those days was pulling in double the numbers that it does now. The big stars on Radio 1 were regularly getting 18, 19 million listeners. Terry Wogan was pulling in 18 million in the morning, which was staggering, really, in a country then of about 58 million. Everybody listened to the radio, not so anymore, but that's what it was like then. And I loved it. It was what I wanted to do. I grew up listening to these characters on Radio 1, Noel Edmonds doing the breakfast show then in those days. I absolutely loved these characters that he would create on the air. Listening to Radio Luxembourg, very crackly, it would fade in and out while I was doing my homework. You couldn't quite hear what was going on, but there was a magic knowing that there was this station you were listening to called the Great 208. On the Today program, there was people like John Timpson and Brian Redhead, and they sounded like giants to me in that they had this ability to communicate and make it sound as though they were just talking to me and make it sound unbelievably easy. And I couldn't understand the magic of how they were able to do this, to speak so fluently and effortlessly. about interesting things all of the time. Along came Capital Radio at that time as well, again with huge stars in London. People like Graham Dean and Mike Smith and so many big names that if you were around at that time in London, you may remember. And then LBC launched around 1974. And that was it for me as well, listening to some of those big shows. Radio wasn't opinionated in those days. The rules were a lot tighter than they are now. And I was listening to a lot of American radio as well. And I don't know what you grew up listening to, Adam, but for me, I was getting tapes of Don Imus and Wolfman Jack and Cousin Brucey and these extraordinary personalities. Dr. Don Rose was another one, a guy called Cousin Brucey in New York. And these tapes would arrive from friends who I managed to find in New York, cassettes. And I would jump on them as soon as I came through the letterbox and listen to what these guys were doing. And I caught the bug big time. So I left home. I worked at Hereward in Northampton, this station. It's no longer there. I then went, I suppose, on a tour of the country doing radio repertory work. It's like doing repertory theatre, if you like, because in those days there was no YouTube, there was no sit down with your laptop and create a radio station. If you wanted to do what I wanted to do, you had to get off your backside and go out and do it. When I saw my careers master at school and told him I wanted to be on the radio, he looked at me like I was crazy. It was a private school in Essex, and he said, well, maybe you should get physics and do it engineering first, or go and get an English degree and become a journalist. I said, you don't understand. I want to be Noel Edmonds and Don Imus and Wolfman Jack, and those guys haven't got journalism degrees. But off I went. And in the end, I ended up studying journalism on the job in newsrooms that I was working in, without having, luckily, to go to university for me, because I just wanted to get my legs under the desk and do the work. So I spent some time in Northampton, then Bristol. I launched a radio station in Bath. Went up to Newcastle, had 5 very happy years on Tyneside. Eventually came back to London to work at Jazz FM, which I ran for a while, jazz was my passion. I loved working there. Then I joined Heart for their London launch, which was a very exciting time. Then moved over to Magic FM before I was eventually poached for LBC. And it was really at LBC that I finally felt at home, because I was never really that happy playing records. It was fun in my early 20s, but I grew out of it quite quickly. I was a disc jockey who wanted to do more. I wanted to talk more between the records, and they would always tell me to shut up. But at LBC, it was all talk, obviously. And it was a case of flying blind every single day. I was allowed to talk about whatever I liked. Presenters still are there. You decide the topics, you decide the subjects, you open the microphone and you say, give me a call. And you're flying by the seat of your pants every day. You don't know who's going to phone in. You don't know what people are going to say. You got to be on your game. You got to be ready to argue and have strong opinions as well. And there were times at LBC where it was quite hairy. In one of the first shows we did, and the station had just relaunched, I think it was week 1 or 2, I was just started an opening monologue about whatever it was we were talking about. And the producer says in my ear, the line has gone down to the telecom tower, which was providing us with our phone, all of the phone calls. So we had 2 hours with no phone calls whatsoever. It was just me talking nonstop for 2 hours. That was a bit hairy. I got used to that working on BBC London, doing some overnight shows much more recently. The phones don't ring, and you can often find yourself talking all night long without any phone calls at all. But 2 things happened to me at LBC. The first one was I was forced to have strong opinions on everything. And 20 years ago, radio wasn't quite as out there as it is now, but it was changing. We were allowed to have opinions. And the brief at the time was, whatever it is you're talking about, tell us what you think and find conflict. It was all about topics that would lead to conflict on the air, because big happy chats about lovely happy jovial conversations about the world wasn't, they thought at the time, as compelling as listening to 2 people arguing. And that became quite jarring after a while. Constantly trying to find topics that polarize an audience. It's easier to do today perhaps than it was then. But as a result of that, my politics veered quite far to the right, because I learned very quickly that left-wing views don't generate radio audiences. They just don't. It's a very strange thing. It's why US talk radio is overwhelmingly to the right. If you listen to the big American talk radio shows, Rush Limbaugh isn't around anymore, but Sean Hannity, Michael Savage, others, some big names who are regularly pulling in 20 million listeners. It's conservative opinion and conservative voices that dominate talk radio in the United States. And even LBC today, if you do listen to RBC, you've got Nick Ferrari. Nick is to the right, I would say. James O'Brien isn't, but James O'Brien, who does the morning show on LBC, is very much, he's managed to keep his career going because of his support for because he was anti-Brexit, so that's where his views lie. But overwhelmingly, most talk radio presenters are to the right politically. Interestingly, there have been attempts to launch liberal or progressive or left-wing talk radio, and it hasn't worked. Air America launched as a network in the States in 2004 with the Senator Al Franken as one of the hosts, and it just didn't take off. And there was a lovely quote from Al Franken at the time who said that liberals don't listen to talk radio because they like nuanced arguments too much. And it just doesn't work because it's too subtle. And there's also a thought that certainly in the States, I'd be interested to see what Adam thinks about this, but if you are progressive or more liberal minded, you're probably listening to the national NPR, National Public Radio, and the morning shows there, which regularly pull in 13, 14 million listeners rather than conservative, tub-thumping, right-wing radio. And after a while, this made me uncomfortable because I was manufacturing views that were my own. It's quite difficult to do. Also around that time, we had the Iraq War, which was interesting. It was 2003. And my opinion of the Iraq War also became skewed because of all of this. And also at the time, because of my views on Israel. And that was when I came out. I came out on the air at that time. I'd never really spoken about being Jewish on the radio. But then I did. And there was a lot. I don't know if you remember 2003, we had the Second Intifada. Ariel Sharon was prime minister. There were lots of suicide bombings around the country. And talking about the Iraq War without talking about what was going on in Israel felt very difficult at the time. So I started talking about my own experiences as a Jew and how I felt about the Iraq War. And it was interesting because I wasn't getting any support at all from anyone else in the community. It was the very early days of BICON. BICON had only just come along, and I had meetings with them about giving me some support and facts and information, which eventually they did. I had a meeting at the embassy at one point with the press officers there. And it was all about Hasbara at that time, a reactive approach to news rather than the proactive public diplomacy approach that they have today. I mean, you could argue there's still a lot of work to do in terms of Israel's PR, but it's a lot better now than it was in 2003. And there weren't many other names in the media at all. In fact, there was hardly anybody putting their head above the parapet saying, I'm Jewish, this is unacceptable. I think it's only actually during the Jeremy Corbyn era where we saw a lot more of that, where we saw names like Tracy, who I know, Tracy Ann Overman and others, saying that we're not happy with what's going on. These views and opinions aren't acceptable. And I had some really uncomfortable exchanges throughout that time. George Galloway was a classic. I clashed with George a number of times. He hung up on me once in the middle of a phone-in. I then went on to work with George at talk radio. I was doing the Late Show, and he would come on after me one night, and that was very uncomfortable. I had one guest who is now at Her Majesty's Pleasure with extremist views, telling my producer after the interview, we know where he lives, we know where your family lives. There was one night at talk radio in the middle of the night, I was doing a phone in Israel, came up, and we had a number of calls saying, we know where you are, we know we know how to find you. So it was difficult being out and on the radio. Working for the BBC, I am less out there than I perhaps would have been on LBC. I often wonder, listening to LBC, Talk Sport, Talk Radio these days, whether I would be so vocal. And I don't know is the answer. I still talk about it, but I don't know. And this was all pre-social media as well at this time. Facebook was a brand new website. It was only available at around 50 colleges. MySpace only launched in 2003. There was no YouTube. It's funny to think it's not that long ago, but so much of the social media that's so central to our news and information now wasn't around. But what I did learn, the positive aspect of my time at LBC, was that we used to say behind every door is a story, and that the best stories come from real life. And I learned that it wasn't the news and the current affairs that excited me. I mean, it's interesting and it's stimulating, chasing big stories and talking about geopolitics and having the debates and the arguments. And I met some fascinating people along the way, but it was real. It was everyday stories that we all have that stuck with me. We used to get them day in, day out. And I was looking through my notes earlier of some of the stories from that time. There was a man I remember who called me one day. We kept him on the phone for half an hour. He was adopted, and he'd only discovered that week that it was an incredible tale, that as a child he'd been thrown from a car by his then mother and found by the side of the road as a toddler. And he'd never never talked about this to anybody. There was another caller who'd been as part of a program on adoption, reunited with a sister he hadn't seen since she'd disappeared at 5 years old. We did a program on shoplifting, and I had a colonel ring me up saying he'd never talked to anybody, but been shoplifting every day for 5 years. And the idea that we've all got stories. We all carry these stories around with us, some more dramatic than others, but for some reason, people are happy to talk about them on the radio. And it taught me that the best radio, and I think this is borne out now from a lot of the podcasts that are doing so well, is that it's those emotional truths, the moments where you can't stop listening because the story you're hearing is just so utterly compelling, or you're listening to something that challenges your assumptions about the world, perhaps makes you feel a little bit uncomfortable, or people who are extraordinary. And I'd like to play you this clip if I can get this to work. I'll tell you what this is just to give it a bit of context. I met a girl at Oxford about 3 years ago called Rebecca Henderson. And it was pitched to me by my news editor as an interview with a young girl who's coming in who carries her heart in a backpack. She had diagnosed with cancer of the heart. She was a student in Oxford, 21 years old, in the middle of her degree, and was obviously incredibly ill. So admitted to hospital, and they decided at Harefield to take her heart out because cancer of the heart isn't meant to happen. Apparently, it's so very, very rare. She was, one of a tiny number of people who've had this around the world. And while she was on the waiting list, they gave her an artificial heart, which she carried around in this backpack. And I didn't know what to expect. I mean, how do you even begin to prepare for an interview like that? And when I came in the morning, she was already there at 6 a.m. with her parents, who followed her everywhere. And as I opened the door, at the end of the corridor, I could hear this. This heart was really, really loud. And I got to know Rebecca. Sadly, she died the beginning of 2020. She had a transplant in the end, and it didn't take. She was alive for a few weeks, and it didn't take. I'm still very close to her parents. They come on the show quite frequently, and I got to know the family very well. But Rebecca came in 2 or 3 times, spent an hour with us talking every day, and she was one of the most inspirational people I've ever met. And I want to play you a little bit of a clip of this, because this for me is what talk radio is really about. It's not about arguing with George Galloway or having endless phone-ins on Brexit. I did hundreds of those over the last few years, or now arguing day in, day out whether there are parties at Downing Street. Talk radio can do that till it's blue in the face, but it's these real people telling real stories. I'm really getting into the underbelly of life that I find so interesting. So I'm going to try and share this if I can. If you can give me a thumbs up and tell me whether you can hear this or not, that would be really, really helpful. And if you can't, give me a thumbs down. Let's try.
In the morning, and the first sound I actually hear is my own heartbeat every day, right next to me on the bedside table. So wake up and it's like, I'm here. And there was such a long time when people thought I wasn't going to be here, that kind of sometimes every day is just sort of a blessing.
I was so looking forward to meeting you this morning, because apart from anything else, I didn't know what to expect, and I didn't expect the noise. Is this something that you've gotten used to?
Yeah, I mean, obviously when I came around in the hospital, it was the first thing that I heard, and it doesn't stop me from sleeping. In fact, most people say it's really like soporific and just sends them off, particularly my mum, who is just napping in the hospital from time to time. Could say a lot about my company, that. But yeah, it's always there, and it's kind of got to the point now where to me it's almost like a little soundtrack to my life, because it's a sound that says, you're alive, you made it, and you're still making it every day.
What's so extraordinary is this is the sound that we all carry with us. but for the rest of us, it's turned down. There's just the sound of life that you're carrying around with you, your life. How does that feel every single day for you?
Some days it's easier than others. I mean, some days it's really hard. And I think one of the things that sometimes gets a bit lost when we talk about illnesses and stuff is like the fact that your day-to-day life is sometimes just, it feels really unbearable. And days like going back to uni and things remind me both of how much I have to look forward to when I finally get my transplant, but they also sometimes come a bit with, this is how much you lost. You can't go to uni by yourself. You can't run around all the libraries that you want to and like flit around the Bodleian as you would have done 2 years ago. And it makes me realize how many things I took for granted. And I mean, I'm incredibly grateful to be alive today, and I wouldn't take the alternative. But I also think, you know, some days I'm not a massively brave person. I just want to hide under my duvet. But there's less of that now.
Just can you?
That's sorry. Can you? How do I stop sharing here? Am I back? Yeah.
No, you're still showing, David. You should see an option at the top, probably in green, to stop sharing.
I got resume share, stop share. There we go.
Yeah.
Did everybody hear that? Okay. Is that all right? Yeah. She was an extraordinary. I still feel moves me listening to Rebecca now, knowing that she's no longer around. She was an incredible young girl, and just listening to her voice and she came in with this backpack that we had to plug in she brought 2 backpacks. One was her spare because the heart that she was carrying only had a 2-hour charge. And at one point I got up and I knocked the extension lead out, which she thought was hilarious, that I knocked off the power to the heart that was keeping her alive. And luckily it was a backup in there, but that was Rebecca. Those are the stories. We did a similar thing a few weeks ago where we did the first ever show to be signed by British Sign Language. There's never been a radio show that's been completely signed by British Sign Language. So we tried this a few weeks ago, following all of the stuff that's been going on with Strictly Come Dancing. And I had a young girl come in, and we gave her the show. It was her show to produce through the morning. And I was slightly anxious interviewing somebody who was tone deaf for 3 hours. And I can send the link if anybody wants to listen to it, but she understood every word I said. You would never know that she was deaf. She was incredibly articulate. The show was signed at the same time on Facebook, and that opened my eyes to a whole new world as well. That again, for me, far more powerful than rowing with people about things that are going on in the news. The BBC, having gone from BBC to LBC, I had to change my game quite significantly, because the BBC, of course, unlike LBC, where I was told to have opinions, you rock up at the BBC and you're not allowed to have an opinion or a belief about anything at all. And it was a very early lesson. When I joined nearly 10 years ago, it was, I came on start very early on. We were talking about climate change. And if you think climate change 10 years ago, the debate then around climate change was very different to where it is now. And it was still okay, believe it or not, to question some of the assumptions. It was okay to question climate change deniers, or to raise questions about some of the research that was out there. And there was a story that Shell had invested in one of the Oxford colleges. I can't remember which, but a bunch of students were unhappy. Their spokesperson came in and I challenged him saying, "What's the problem? Blah, blah, blah." I gave quite a confrontational interview, far more than I would do today, but I still have my LBC head on. And I said something to the effect of, some people don't think that climate change is real, and it's happening. The student was just this young lad was winding me up in that way that students sometimes can. And he went off and I thought, well, that was a good interview. But he mobilized all of his friends and students right across the country, and they all flooded the BBC with complaints about me. I'd been there about a week. And the next thing I knew, it had triggered a complaints process that went all the way up to the very top of the corporation. I was dragged into local editors, regional editors, and then to the BBC editorial board, right at the very top. I'd only been there 5 minutes. This was from one interview where I was slightly irritated by a young student. And in the end, an apology was was published on the main BBC board website, because I learned then that it was the BBC's editorial policy that climate change was a thing. And my crime was not to back up what I was saying with facts. And if I'd quoted somebody, if I'd said such and such a professor thinks rather than some people think, then I might have been okay. But it was a steep learning curve. And I realized there at that moment that every time you open your mouth on the BBC, and this is relevant as we come on to talk about the current debate around anti-Semitism, you have to be very, very careful. It's a very nervous atmosphere at the moment for anybody who sits behind a camera or behind a microphone on any BBC network, whether it's radio or TV. In the last 2 years, I've had to take now 3 impartiality courses. The last one was just a few weeks ago, and they're long. They're long 4 or 5 hour courses that you have to sit through, plus a course on confirmation bias, which is very interesting, challenging all the views that you don't believe you have, but it turns out you do have. And this is because the BBC will live or die and is obsessed, I think quite rightly, with being independent, impartial, and as they say, truthful. And as part of the impartiality course, and I want to play you something and this was before the recent row over the business with over the bus, and that Ofcom are now investigating. Interesting, that was the latest development this week. But Stephen Pollard, formerly of the Jewish Chronicle, and he's a good friend, Steve, and he wrote an article a few weeks ago in the paper saying he thinks the BBC has a problem with Jews. And I don't think it does. From where I'm sitting every day, I don't think it does. I think and to say that the BBC is institutionally racist, we had the accusations from that really shook me up before Christmas from the Simon Wiesenthal Centre saying the BBC is one of the worst in the world. And I want to take them seriously. It's such a respectful organisation, and yet to label an organisation of the BBC has 33,000 staff as anti-Semitic, it just felt a bit lazy to me to say that. And it's not my experience. What I see every day from my corner in Oxfordshire, perhaps, you know, I'm cut off from what goes on at Broadcasting House, but I've got a lot of friends there as well. And I see people going out of their way every single day to check and double check and triple check everything that goes to the air for accuracy and balance. And the BBC doesn't get it right. They get, I checked before this call, it's about 250,000 complaints a year. It's about 3,000 complaints a day. If they ran any story on Israel, that goes up to about 10,000 complaints straight away. And those 10,000 complaints will be split right down the middle. You'll have 5,000 pro-Israel, 5,000 anti-Israel, all complaining, all saying that the report that they've just seen told them exactly a different story, which I always think is really, really interesting. But I don't think the organisation is anti-Semitic because of what I'm allowed to do. In 2020, for the 75th anniversary of Bergen-Belsen, liberation of Bergen-Belsen, my editor asked me to go and record a first-person account talking about how I felt. I'd never been before, for an hour-long documentary, because it just so happens in Oxfordshire, it was the Oxfordshire Yeomanry, the anti-tank regiment that were the very first troops into Bergen-Belsen. So we had lots of local stories from family members, descendants, grandchildren who their grandparents had told them stories about, their grandfathers had told them stories about being there. So we had those first-person accounts, and I was to go and record this documentary. It didn't happen, which I was really upset about because of COVID. But that wouldn't happen in an anti-Semitic organisation. And even this week, we were talking about whether I could go out there again, perhaps, and do it this year. I don't think an anti-Semitic broadcaster would run the stuff with Prince Charles this week, which was incredibly powerful television. The Portraits hour, if you haven't seen that, it's on iPlayer, the Portraits of Survivors. I did 10, 15 minutes, which is quite a lot of non-continual speech on Holocaust Memorial Day this week, playing survivors' testimonies. And I want to play you this clip here. This is my colleague Emma Barnett, who was hosting, she's Woman's Hour these days, but this was a show on 5 Live going back last year. I think it was in the summer of last year. And I want to play you this because this came up as part of our impartiality training last summer. In the middle of the course, the chap who was leading the session, who's the head of BBC England, so he's quite senior, runs all of the BBC regional networks across the country. He said, I want you to have a listen to this and tell me whether you think this is impartial or not. And this is Emma talking about her firsthand experience of anti-Semitism while she was on holiday. And she felt the need to talk about this on her show. I'll play you this a clip of this and I'll give it a bit of context. Here we go.
I don't know what you were up to on Friday. Me, I was eating some chippy chips, bread and butter, and some scampi in Norfolk on my holidays. And to you, I returned today. Unbeknownst to me, though, on Friday, the last day of my holiday, and perhaps even to many of you, a bloke called Wiley, often referred to as the godfather of grime, a very successful musician from East London who's been awarded an MBE for his services to music, was beginning a stream of foul anti-Semitism on social media, specifically Twitter. Some of his now removed tweets read like they're straight out of the Hitler playbook of 1930s Nazi Germany, the regime this country so bravely went into battle and defeated. Let me give you a flavour of them if you haven't had a look at these messages. Jewish people are cowards. Do something to me, I'm waiting. Jewish people act rough, but they hide behind the police. Who writes the laws? Who changes the laws? Who implements new laws? Who? What is the 5%ers? Who are they all? Who runs the world? Who runs the banks? Who writes the law book? Who hides behind the police? Who owns the police? That was Wiley tweeting about Jews. I caught up with these messages last night, 48 hours later, and I started to think about work this week and catch up on the news agenda. Those words burn. I'm sure I don't need to tell most of you that, but just in case I do, they burn deep and they're deeply dispiriting, and they play on a very well hidden fear a lot of Jewish people have that someday anti-Semitism will rise up once more. Because anti-Semitism is fresh and so raw for us. To tell you this, to take you into my life, my grandmother escaped the Nazis from Wiener Neustadt in Austria and found sanctuary as a housemaid in this country. My husband's grandmother survived unspeakable torture in Auschwitz, in Europe, a 2-hour flight from here. I've been there. He can't go. He can't bear it. These were our grandmothers who read us bedtime stories safe in our beds in this country. This happened to them in their lifetime, people I met and loved. Only 2 weeks ago, a week before I went away, I opened Twitter on my phone. What did I see? I saw Jewish privilege trending. Do you know how that feels? Do you know how frightening that is? How angering that is? I've had my fair share of abuse online, much of it sexist and politically charged. It's all out there. You can go and have a look. You may have contributed to it. You may have fought against it. Thank you. But the one bit of abuse that always stops me in my tracks and makes me feel angry, sad, and burned, to use that word again, is when I get anti-Semitic abuse.
I'll stop that there. I thought it was really interesting radio that at the time. I remember hearing it live. I mean, that was to 6 million people. It was an ad-lib monologue, and we were played that as part of our impartiality training. And the question afterwards was, do you think that that was impartial? And everybody ummed and ahed, and I said no. And what was interesting was that that wasn't something she'd done on the spur of the moment. She'd spoken to her editor, who'd spoken to somebody else senior at the BBC, in the way that things are. LBC, you'd just go on and you'd do that without even thinking, or Talk Radio, or any of these other commercial stations. She cleared it through about 4 or 5 different people, and they said, fine, it's your lived experience. It's absolutely legitimate. It's a story from your own life. Go ahead and do it. And I only play that because I think, again, I'm not here to bang the drum for the BBC, but it's just another example, I think, of proof that the organization isn't anti-Semitic to its core. You wouldn't be able to do that in an organization that is. None of this, I will say, excuses the coverage of the abuse directed towards those teenagers on that minibus. But I think it is more, excuse my language, it is a cock-up, not conspiracy. I think what happened there was a stupid mistake. And as is often the case, it's the cover-up that's worse than they could have sorted it out very, very quickly at the time, but they didn't. And it's interesting reading some of the language from the Executive Complaints Unit, this shady independent body that I don't really understand, that deals with all BBC complaints, where they talk about alleged, and they're very careful about the language they're using. And it's because they're so frightened of upsetting anybody now that they don't want to say anything either way. And as a result, they end up upsetting everybody. I think that's what's happened. And it'll be interesting to see what the Ofcom ruling. The coverage of Israel, which I've left to the end of this rant about BBC and anti-Semitism, I think is another thing entirely. And they do make an awful lot of mistakes. And I think the problem with a lot of the coverage of Israel is, and I think the BBC does this in a lot of news coverage, and it's perhaps something they need to do less of, and that's make assumptions about listener and viewer knowledge. And we're starting to run what we call a lot more explainers, fact boxes, as they call them in news, that as you run a story, you know, here's something that's happened, but here's the background. And sometimes it can seem patronizing. Let's just tell you what happened, to put this story in a bit of context. I don't think we can do enough of that. I think we make way too many assumptions. Most people, as Tony Blair said recently, aren't engaged in politics. Most people, particularly youngsters these days, aren't following the news as my parents did or my generation does, sitting down and watching a news bulletin. And I think that we should do a lot more. You know, if a Palestinian has been shot, if there's a story that appears to be pro-Palestinian, then it needs to be put into context afterwards. Here is some background so that you understand what's going on. And I don't think that we do nearly enough of that, or indeed any of that. Actually, it's very, very rare that the history or the background or some of the deeper stories are given. There's just that chase for the sensational all the time, because look, here's a Palestinian home that's been razed to the ground, so that'll make good fodder for the 9 o'clock news, rather than perhaps setting it in a wider context. That's what I think they should be doing, and that's certainly what we're trying to do with some of our stories, because they get it wrong day in, day out, and it's subtle, but it's not nice to watch. And quite often, a friend of mine now is a Middle East correspondent, and I constantly arguing Tom Bateman used to be my news editor at Heart years ago, and I'm constantly arguing with Tom about this. And interestingly, he agrees that yes, he'd like to run a lot more background pieces that give wider context. That's what I think they should be heading towards. And what bothers me again about all of this is where we are, just to finish off for questions, is where we are with news these days. I think it is so important, as we get into the debate about the future of the BEEB and the license fee and what the BBC is for, that we have an organisation that can provide, or at least try to provide, impartial news coverage. Because where we get reliable information, where we get the news that best serves us, our families, gives us the information we need to make those decisions so that we can best serve our family and make decisions about our lives. When I look at my children, when I look at other youngsters, they're not engaging with news at all. TikTok is their news network. Twitter is their news network. And with the best will in the world, they're not getting reliable information. And I think it is impossible to, it's interesting on our impartiality courses, the one thing that always comes up is that it is impossible to be impartial. It's a noble idea, it's a lofty ideal, it's worth aiming for. All news ultimately will be seen through a lens of opinion and prejudice. It's impossible to get away from that, I think. You try and present facts, but these things, particularly in our world now, are very subtle, but we're drowning in information. Everyone's looking for that dopamine hit, the clickbait. We're wired like dopamine rats to keep scrolling and clicking and looking for something, an opinion that perhaps agrees with the opinion we already have on whatever it might be. And therefore, look, I'm right. And now more than ever, we saw that especially as an and finally for me during the pandemic. During the pandemic, the number of times from people I know who should know better, I would hear, have you heard, have you seen, apparently? And I would say over and over again, apparently, what's your source? What's your source? And it was drilled into us from day one of the pandemic at the BEEB. Verify, 2 or 3 sources. Where are you getting your information from? And I remember on our local neighborhood WhatsApp group here at one point, I'm sure we all saw that, there were things flying around. Have you heard? Apparently, one was apparently you can catch COVID from petrol pumps was one thing that, and I jumped in and said, where are you get, what's your source? Have you verified? Have you got 2 reliable sources? Where has this come from? A professor, what professor? And this is where we need news organizations at times like this to say, hang on a minute. And I've got one final clip to play you here. And because of all the many guests, I'm very privileged in Oxford to meet some fantastic people. And I got to meet Kath, completely forgotten her name. Let me just pull up the clip. Here she is, Kath Green, who together with Professor Sarah Gilbert developed the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. And because they're based in the city, I got to know them quite well through various interviews. In very early days of the pandemic, I spoke to Professor Andrew Pollard a number of times, and he was talking to me about how they were working 24 hours a day and he was sleeping 2 hours a night, and they were hopeful that they might come up with the vaccine. And this clip here is another example, just to finish. It's one of my favorite interviews of last year. This is Kath Green talking about taking time out in October 20. I don't know about you, but the time over the last year has just warped for me. But I think this was end of 2021. And she'd taken a holiday, and it was 2020, taken a holiday, beg your pardon, and she shouldn't have really been away, but she was camping and she heard some people talking about the vaccine and how they weren't going to bother taking it. And here she was developing the vaccine. Have a listen to this clip, because I love this story. It's a great example of a compelling story on the radio from a woman who is a fantastic professor and very real. Have a listen to this.
So I was on a camping holiday, foot of Snowdon, beautiful remote campsite, myself and my daughter in a tiny tent, queuing for a pizza at the local pizza bar. And the lady in front of me was talking to her friend about one of the conspiracy theories which was doing the rounds at the time, which I don't know if you remember at that time, but it was 5G, and that the virus or the vaccine was somehow linked to 5G network, and there was going to be some trackers in the vaccine that were going to be harmful to people. And she was saying that one of the things she was concerned about was really that she didn't know what was in the vaccine, and she didn't trust the people that had made it. And obviously I'm standing behind her in the queue thinking, well, I'm the person that made it, and I really do know what's in the vaccine because my team are the people who have formulated it. So I just introduced myself and said, I know I don't look like this because I'm standing there in my camping gear. Yeah, I don't look like an academic scientist. And just introduced myself and said, I'm Kath. And if you have any questions about what's in the vaccine, do talk to me, because I'd like to put your mind at ease, or at least explain to you who I am and what I do. So I was on a camping holiday, foot of Snowdon.
There you go. I love that story. I think it's absolutely brilliant. Imagine hearing someone tell you that they're not going to take the vaccine because they don't know what's in it, and you know because you've made it. Amazing. So there we are. I think that's why it's important to have these people telling stories, telling us the facts. And you wouldn't hear an interview with someone like her on TikTok, for example. You only get that from the Beep. And there we go.
David, I mean, you've kind of brought up lots of interesting things. I can see there's a couple of questions, comments in the chat, which you may want to address. I'm going to take the spotlight off and put it on gallery so I can see if anyone would like to ask a question. I see Jackie's raised her digital hand. And so, Jackie, if you want to go first, I'll hand it over to you.
I just want to say thank you very much. Absolutely amazing presentation. And I'm a avid radio listener from the days of many years ago, the start of Capital or whatever. Not so much an LBC, but Radio 4 is my thing. And as much as I love the BBC, there are things that are great, and there always have been things that are great. And we made a sad decision. It's like, you know, crossing the floor of the house or changing shawl or something like that. We now listen to ITN News at 10. About a month ago, we made the decision that News and 10, we have switched to ITN. The rest of the day, we're listening to Radio 4. But it was like a thing in the household. It was sad, but we felt more comfortable doing it. And I know other people who've done the same. And I know it's a bit like Neil Young taking himself off Spotify. You know, it won't make any difference to Spotify. But yes, this was our feeling. But, you know, thank you so much for your presentation. And I thought it was absolutely amazing. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. They make mistakes every day. And I'm in a position at the moment where I keep thinking I should put my hand up and say, look, I think you're getting a lot of things wrong. Do you want some help, to the senior editorial board? And I don't know whether I want to jump into that fire or not. I know people very high up the managing director of the BBC I started out with when I was 17. He's a very good friend. And I know that if I approached him and said, do you think you've got a problem with Jews and some of the coverage, because maybe I could help? I don't know if I'm ready for that fight. It's something which I'm wrestling with at the moment. And there was, for me, and we've all had those moments where you think, that's not right. I had one at Christmas reading about the Ghislaine Maxwell trial on the BBC News website, and they referred to Robert Maxwell, and the copy read, Robert Maxwell, who was a Jew. And I thought, well, why is that relevant to the story? It has absolutely, you wouldn't have written Robert Maxwell, who was Roman Catholic. And it was extraordinary. And then I thought, am I being too sensitive here? And I actually sent it to a friend, another journalist, to say, what do you think of this? And we talked about it. It's those moments that I find really uncomfortable. So yeah, little work to be done.
Indeed. Other questions, comments? Leonie, I see a physical hand rather than digital one. That works too.
Hi there. Thank you for a brilliant presentation. Really interesting. I'm a radio fan. It's always on. I love it and always have loved it. My kids, on the other hand, don't really get it. And I worry about the future of radio. And I wonder, is there anything happening to try and engage the kids? I don't know, should they be using TikTok to release little snippets? Or I don't know. Is there anything being done to try to communicate to the younger generation at all? Because I wonder when I'm older if there will be a radio left.
I don't know if there will be, actually. And it's a real existential problem for radio. The podcast is exploding at the moment. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and about you, there's audiobooks. The competition for the audio market is intense. So radio as we know it, my kids have radios in their room, but they don't listen to them. They're listening to Spotify, or they're streaming, or it's social media, or whatever. They're not sitting down like I used to and listen to the radio. I don't know is the answer. It's a real issue. You hope that perhaps as they grow up, things will change, but then I don't know what radio is going to look like in 10 years' time. If you think of the changes that we've seen, and there's a lot more digital stations coming online. The whole media landscape is in such a state of flux. I find it confusing now as to what's going on a lot of the time. It's not as straightforward as it was, which again is why I think it's so important to have something that is reliable and at least tries to present news and facts and information, all of those virtuous aims and goals, because otherwise, where are we going to get our information from about the world, apart from our social media feeds? Sorry, I can't hear anybody.
Other questions, comments? David, I see a physical hand. Yeah. You're on mute there. There you go.
Yeah, okay, yeah, I know. I've got quite a lot of questions. So I'm choosing the one, but I was waiting to see if other people are going to ask, because I don't want to grab so much time. But I'll ask the one question that's maybe standing out for me, and that's possibly on a personal level. Personal for you is what your feeling was when you were in talk radio. That, I mean, I might be wrong but the idea is to get people to phone in on the premium lines, especially that was the case. So how did you feel as a presenter trying to get these people to spend their money and keep them on the line as long as possible?
Yeah, I've never thought of it in terms of the fact that the calls are costing them money. You mean? Honestly, it was something I'd never thought about. We were told to treat callers on talk radio like each caller was the record that you were playing. That was how it was. Instead of playing records, you've got a caller, and you hope they're going to be entertaining for 3 or 4 minutes, and they're going to tell a story or say something outrageous or prompt somebody else to call. It's quite depressing after a while, though, especially when what's interesting is not many people phone talk radio stations around the country. There's probably about, I've never put a number on it, but I hear the same voices over and over again, whatever I'm listening to. Maybe 100 or so people that regularly phone in to radio stations. It's really interesting, and they are the same characters, and to the point where if there's an Israel topic that comes on, I can turn on Nick Ferrari or Nikki Campbell on 5 Live, or even any questions on Radio 4. I know I'll hear. I know the voices that I will hear. And I know where they are and where they. Nigel from Temple Fortune will be on the phone, and I mean, there's half a dozen of them. I know them all very well now, and it's quite funny. And they love it. They absolutely love coming on. And I know what they're going to say as well before they say it. So
it doesn't. Just a thought to follow up on that. I've always suspected that. It's interesting to have it confirmed. That's actually quite a small sample.
yeah, very small.
In some way, the social media landscape is very chaotic, but doesn't it actually provide for the opportunity to have a lot more voices? Does it mean a kind of democratization of the opportunity for opinions, even if that means more bad opinions?
Absolutely. What's interesting is the number of callers to speak to traditional phone-in shows is really declining, because in the old days, if you wanted to have a say about something, you would either write to the editor of your newspaper, I'll write to the letters page, or I'll phone up a local radio station. And those are the two ways, or write to your MP, where you can shout and have something to say. And now that's been taken away. If you've got a voice, there's any number of ways that you can shout and try and make yourself heard, which I think is really interesting. And we will get far more messages in the morning, texts and tweets and what have you, than we will phone calls. People are much more reluctant to phone in than they ever used to.
Really, really interesting. Any last thoughts or questions? We've got just a minute or two left. David.
Actually, I don't have a question, but I want just to share my perspective as a foreigner in the UK, from Italian. So I used to use the radio to understand the culture here. And then I broke up completely with the BBC because although I'm radio, I don't have TV at home, so I just radio. But it's always the same voices. There is not diversity. There's not really what you're thinking about these. It always seems like a BBC News all the time. So, but I listen BBC for a few programs that are on, BBC 3, I think, BBC 4, Channel 4, no, BBC 4. But I completely stopped to listen news because I don't think it's appealing for me as a 36 years old. It seems that it speaks for, an audience that over 50s. So I don't think that it's really appealing anymore. But it's very difficult to understand which is the best radio in UK somehow. As for me, I'm not British, because you need to understand also which is the culture beneath the speakers. So for this reason, I'm still listening, American radios or Italian radios, because it's a bit clear what is the spectrum they belongs to. I don't know if it makes sense, but it was a very interesting to hear you, and so I'm very grateful.
Thank you. I listen to the World Service a lot, by the way. World Service is my station.
Yeah.
I absolutely love it. I think it's one of the best things they do, and it has extraordinary resources. I went in to do a show on Christmas Day a year ago for BBC London, and I came out on the wrong floor, and there was 100 or so people working, and it was the BBC's Persia service. Now, whether the license fees, money should be spent on this, I don't know. It's a whole separate debate. But the fact that they were there churning stuff out for the Middle East at that time of night and for an Arab market, I thought was extraordinary. I love the World Service. I really do.
I can definitely echo your sentiments, David, as a fellow foreigner. And I've learned a great deal about Britain through listening to the radio. When I first arrived, and I got a sense that you can tell someone's social economic status or class by what grocery store they shop at. There's also some degree of mapping that onto radio stations that I listen to, and it's been really interesting. Partially, David, thank you for sharing so much of yourself tonight, but it's also particularly interesting because you've been at so many different types of radio and seen such a wide spectrum of it. It gives us a real window, I think, into how broad the market can be, and also what its constraints are. So I'm glad that you're back to doing shul speaking events. I'm sorry there's no fish dinner to go with this one, but it's been a real pleasure to have you on air, so to speak, this evening with us on Zoom.
Thank you for asking me. I ramble a lot, but thank you for asking me. Thank you.
It's literally your job, so you do a very good job, and you kept exactly to time, which I expected you would. Thank you to everyone for joining us, and once again, thank you to David for closing out our Havdallah at home this year. and sharing a little bit about his work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was really, really interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So interesting. Thank you.